So for people who are joining now, welcome to our webinar. We'll wait a little bit until everybody's had a time to sign in. We have people joining us through Huva, our conference platform, other people joining directly through YouTube or through Zoom. So it's a couple of minutes past 8. And as we just discussed, the Swiss and the Dutch, we're both known for our punctuality. So I propose to make a start with this webinar. If you can see me, that would be wonderful. So everybody who's joined us, welcome everybody to tonight's webinar, which also doubles as a soft or a pre-launch of ICPR 2020. So not only are we bringing you a wonderful webinar, but we're using this conversation to test out our platform as well. So if you have any constructive feedback, please be nice. We're very open to it. And for those of you who've already joined ICPR, thank you very much. And let this be my pre-official welcome as well. It's great and a little funny to connect with you from my living room. And for those of you joining from outside, coming Thursday will be the grand opening of our upcoming international conference. And this is a slight preview of that, which is ICPR 2020. And this will be our 4th interdisciplinary conference on psychedelic research, and obviously the first that's fully online. So if you don't have access yet, but you are considering registering, please go to icpr2020.net/tickets. They're only 99 euros for students, 149 for others, and this will provide access to a lot of content, and I'm going to share a little bit about what we have planned for this 4-day conference. So I'm going to share just a little bit because we have a program that's chock full of the latest scientific research, both from the hard sciences, such as, neuroimaging techniques to measure brain changes, connectivity under the influence of different psychedelics, pharmacology of microdosing, humanities research, social sciences, historical research, multidisciplinary 5-MeO-DMT research, and much more. We'll also have some patient and therapist testimonies about their experiences with psilocybin and MDMA treatment that I'm personally really looking forward to. And importantly, we don't at ICPR just discuss research results, but we'll also address some of the practical implications of the current wave of research. So, for example, how can we train future therapists, and who can even be a therapist? And since psychedelic research does not take place in a vacuum, we'll also reflect critically on the effects and implications of mainstreaming psychedelics, of the medicalization of psychedelics, and what that means. And I won't name everything that's in our program, because we'll have about 100 speakers and close to 30 poster presentations during the whole conference. And the conference, may be important to note, will take place at a time that will make it accessible to people in Europe and Africa and in the Americas. So we'll start at 4 p.m. each day here in Amsterdam, which will be on the east coast of the US, close to 10 o'clock in the morning. On the west coast, it will be 7 o'clock in the morning. So it'll be a little bit inconvenient for some, for all of us basically, but it will allow many of us to join this event. And tonight's webinar will be a short sneak preview about some of the topics we'll have at ICPR, which includes a full day of ayahuasca research, which includes clinical research, anthropology, taking EEG measures into the jungle, taking ayahuasqueros back into the lab, and ending with a panel discussion on the globalization of ayahuasca. Okay. So just to let you know, because this is an online conference, it won't just be cognitive. In addition to expanding your knowledge, we'll also take care of your physical and your emotional needs. So we'll have networking opportunities through our platform that really do facilitate connection, I've noticed already. And we'll offer some more embodied experience in between the presentations. So we'll do documentary screenings, we'll offer deep listening, musical journeys, we'll have daily workouts, breathwork sessions, embodiment circles. That are all aimed to ground you in between the presentations. So it is my great pleasure to announce tonight's panelists, David Dupuy and Jeremy Narby. And as we just reminisced upon, it's an extra special pleasure and an honor to be able to welcome back Jeremy Narby, because back in 2007, when we had just started the Open Foundation and organized our very first lecture, Jeremy was our very first speaker, together with Dutch anthropologist and researcher Arno Adelaars. And today he's back speaking about ayahuasca. And it's not only that makes it special, it was only a few days before we were forced to postpone our conference back in March, that Jeremy had accepted a late invitation to come and speak in Amsterdam. He bought a plane ticket, and then 2 or 3 days later, we had to say, sorry, the measures related to COVID make it impossible to do the conference in person now. So he had to cancel his trip. So despite his unavailability next week, I think we're very fortunate to have somebody who is as eloquent as he's flexible and understanding with us tonight. And he will be joined by fellow anthropologist David Dupuy, who will also be speaking at the conference in a few days, who will have a discussion about ayahuasca and its cultural dimensions. So while Western civilization is slowly but steadily opening up to integrating psychedelics in our medical models, it is basically the indigenous cultures of South America that represent the oldest living heritage of a society that does not carry the same stigmas toward the ritual use of plant medicines. So what can we learn from these civilizations? What is ayahuasca? How can anthropology help us integrate their insights within our cultural framework? All of these questions, and maybe some won't, be addressed by Jeremy Narby and David Dupuy. So for those of you who are joining us through Whova, you'll have the ability to submit questions through our Q&A function. This won't be available to the people joining from YouTube and Zoom. And in about 45 minutes, I'll tune back into the call with you and share some of these questions. So without further ado, let's welcome Jeremy and David.
Thanks, Joss. Well, Jeremy, like the last time we see each other was a few months ago in Paris, where we were giving a conference together. And since then, the world has changed a lot. So I'm very happy to see you again. And I wanted to thank the organizer of the ICPR, like first of all, for the invitation, but also for having thought to make this event possible despite the crazy context of the last few months. We always need inspiring and meaningful events, and especially in time like this.
Yeah, well, it's good to see you, David. And I think we've only ever spoken in French together, so this will be interesting.
Yeah, so that will be a good opportunity to try my English. And as everybody knows, like French people are really bad in foreign languages, so please excuse my French.
I'm surprised at how good it sounds.
So I have a few questions. We talked together with Jeremy about a few questions. And first of all, like, Jeremy, you first visited the Amazon like 35 years ago. And I've been a pioneer in contemporary ayahuasca research, inspiring many people, including myself, with your book to go to the Amazon. Since then, ayahuasca has become like an increasingly mainstream topic, as you know, and there are now tons of travel stories, scientific articles, YouTube videos, which are dedicated to what was until recently a mysterious brew used by only few people in the Western Amazon. So I wanted to know, like, how do you see the evolution of the ayahuasca field in the last decades and this increasing interest for ayahuasca in the global north?
Yes, well, truth be told, in 1984 in Peru, there were no travelers. I mean, there were a few hippie travelers going to Machu Picchu. Most had never heard of ayahuasca. Ayahuasca really was an obscure Amazonian hallucinogen. Maybe some of the first generation of psychedelic enthusiasts had read the Yahe papers, and so by Burroughs and Ginsberg. But actually, the whole thing about LSD was that it was tasteless. It was a little pill that you swallowed, and then bingo, you were in a psychedelic land. Ayahuasca had written on the package, it makes you vomit, it makes you hallucinate fluorescent serpents. Nobody went down to Peru in the 60s following Ginsberg to go looking for ayahuasca. And then in the 70s, hallucinogens became illegal and frowned upon, and scientific research was impossible on them. At this point, science had already studied LSD with hundreds, even more than 1,000 studies, scientific studies of LSD in the 50s, in the 60s, up until the point it became illegal. There were 0 scientific studies on ayahuasca at that point. And then, so ayahuasca made it to the end of the 20th century and really into the middle of the 1990s. I remember writing The Cosmic Serpent starting in 93 and publishing in 95. And in 93, the people around me in Switzerland and in France that I'd run into, ayahuasca, but they hadn't really heard of it. There were starting to be some Santo Daime churches so there were people in Europe who had heard of it, but the mainstream not only had not heard of it, they didn't know how to pronounce it. And there was no science of it. And so there were a few studies. And so then, for example, Dennis McKenna in 1984, following Laurent Rivière, who was a Swiss chemist, they'd started looking for the active ingredient of ayahuasca. And here we see science at work. And we talk about the difficulties of translation. They came up with this idea that, well, there are MAO inhibitors in the vine, and DMT is normally not orally active, but if it's accompanied by MAO inhibitors, it gets through the stomach, and bingo, what you have with ayahuasca is an orally active form of DMT. This sort of eureka moment for the science, the very young science of ayahuasca, the first chemical studies in the 70s and 80s came up with this idea. The problem is that there are many forms of ayahuasca that do not contain DMT. And actually, it's called ayahuasca after the vine that does not contain DMT. The ayahuasca vine contains beta-carbolines, harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine. Apparently, these substances, at least individually, are present in the vine and in the brew that comes from the vine in doses that the scientists considered too low to be psychoactive. So the psychoactivity of ayahuasca needed explaining, and the DMT MAO inhibitor explanation was a sort of perfect reductionist fit. But the first ayahuasca that any scientist came across, Richard Spruce, in the late 19th century, the English ethnobotanist, was a pure ayahuasca vine extract without any DMT. He didn't really try enough to get a feeling of it, but Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov in the same area of Colombia about 100 years later did. He drank 6 cups of pure ayahuasca extracts, and you can read it. It's one of the first classical descriptions in the anthropological literature of ayahuasca visions. And well, he saw micro photographs of plants and undulating colors and peacock tails and fireworks. I mean, the guy had visions on pure ayahuasca vine without DMT. And actually, if you ask people in the Amazon, so what is the recipe? How do you make ayahuasca? Well, you take the vine, and then the whole point is that you add whatever you want to it, depending on what you want to find out about the plant, what kind of session you want to have. Jonathan Ott found 97 different additives or admixture plants to ayahuasca, including tobacco, toé, coca, and then the DMT-containing plants. And this means that any given ayahuasca brew can contain, besides the beta-carbolines of the vine, nicotine or DMT or cocaine or scopolamine. And these are all psychoactive molecules in their own right. So actually, what I think that it may sound strange to say, but I think a real understanding of what ayahuasca is, it's like the word cocktail. Ayahuasca is a cocktail. Actually, just an extract of the vine itself is full of different bioactive compounds that haven't really been studied yet. Just a pure vine extract is a complex cocktail of bioactive substances. But then the whole point about a cocktail is that it's a mixer, and there is no standard cocktail. Somebody who's going to say, I will serve you a standard cocktail, you know, you have to reply, no, thank you. I mean, what can this be? It's like, or it's like the word sauce. Somebody who says, I'm going to give you some standard sauce. But the whole point is that there are many different kinds of possible sauces. And that's the whole point about ayahuasca. There is no fixed recipe. There are many different kinds of possible ayahuascas. Jonathan Ott, I think, got it right when he said, ayahuasca is an all-purpose pharmacological vehicle.
Yeah.
And so then, meanwhile, I'll give the thing back to you just after this rant here. When science starts looking at a substance like it has ayahuasca in the last 20 years, it likes to have standardized things to look at. And that's the whole idea, is that you can have different tests at different times and different places with one standardized product, and then you know what you're talking about. And so then when you look at the studies that are done now and that are published, they're always telling you, well, first of all, ayahuasca is active DMT. They tell you often that the main plants, and they give Psychotria viridis first, and then the ayahuasca vine second. You know, the science has suddenly defined that actually what ayahuasca is vine and Psychotria viridis, and that's all. And this is standardized ayahuasca, even though actually you can have huge variations in the levels of DMT. And this has also been studied, which is that if you go and sample, as Hele Kasik has done, she's an Estonian biochemist, and she sampled over 100 different kinds of ayahuascas among neo-shamanic practitioners and then indigenous Amazonian practitioners. And she found that on average, the neo-shamanic samples had 57% more DMT than the indigenous ones. And she said that these are brews that emphasize tripping over healing. So where the races have started, but they've kind of started on false premises. And I think that there is a need to think a little bit about, well, just questions as basic as what is ayahuasca? Also, I mean, well, here, I'll give the microphone back to you. That's if we're going to do any kind of ping pong.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the most important developments in the field in recent years has been the revival of clinical studies on psychedelics. So like the integration of those substances on the lab. This is definitely good news from my point of view, as we have good reason to think that there is a great potential for therapeutic benefits of these substances in treatment of depression, anxiety, addiction, or PTSD. However, like among anthropologists, many of us feel that, yeah, in this process, there are very important aspects that these substances and their uses are lost. And being myself an anthropologist involved in many interdisciplinary research projects, I frequently point out to my neuroscientist or cognitive psychologist friends that many of the essential elements of the uses that usually surround the use of psychedelics are erased by the experimental testing. And it's quite striking, for instance, like that experimental studies often reduce the substances to their psychopharmacological effect. Like this leads a lot of researchers like to ignore, for instance, the somatic effects, like even if they are like considered by indigenous population to be the most important. For instance, like, as you know, vomiting is usually considered as an adverse effect in biomedical perspective, while it's considered as a sign of cleansing, which is at the heart of the ayahuasca therapeutic effect from the indigenous perspective. Like, moreover, in experimental studies, psychedelic substances are often approached from the standpoint of pharmacological reductionism, which denies, as you say, the complexity of the mixtures and also the ritual context that frame its use. And finally, sometimes I have the feeling that it's the cultural dimension in itself that seems to be raised in the laboratory setting. I mean, a lot of studies are in fact based on objectivizing dynamic, that is that of modern science. But this erases the animist dimension that surrounds these practices in indigenous context. Even if, as I have been able to observe in the field, it is often the construction of relationship with usually invisible beings that is experienced as therapeutic. So yeah, I feel that there's much which is lost in translation in this contemporary process of medicalization of ayahuasca and other psychedelics.
Well, I agree with much of what you said, and I would add there's one little bit where I disagree when we're talking about erasure of culture, because, and I'll go back to the point that you raised, and it's a very important one, at least from the Amazonian perspective, as I understand it. So here we have a plant mixture that in the Peruvian Amazon is commonly called la purga, the purge. And then anthropologists like Peter Gao and other people, they've given the microphone over to indigenous people, say, why do you drink ayahuasca? The Piro people told Peter Gao is that the first reason we drink ayahuasca is because it's good to vomit. And the second reason is because it's good to see things. You can see everything. But, so it's good to vomit. Ah, yes, well, this is a pretty Amazonian concept. I must say, I learned to vomit in the Amazon. And it's true. When our clinical and neuroscientist researchers try to bring ayahuasca into the lab, and then they call vomiting, which occurs regularly with la purga, a side effect, they're not getting it. They're not erasing the animist culture. They're imposing their own. That's where I think it's actually not an erasure of culture. It's more like they're tone deaf. They're not hearing it, and they're submerged in their own. And, I mean, I was educated in a Western culture. I know that everybody think, vomiting is bad and, ooh, vomiting, gross, just talking about vomiting was uncool. And actually with ayahuasca, Westerners are learning to vomit. And, hey, I've been vomiting, what is it now, 35 years or more. And there's nothing like a good ayahuasca purge, I think. But, hey, we don't want to be promoting it right here. But anyway, so what I mean is that, and then look, there's this other thing that, so even in this conference, we're talking about psychedelics and we're considering ayahuasca a psychedelic. And without even going back to, well, what kind of ayahuasca are we talking about? Is it the one full of DMT, which is going to be very psychedelic, or is it one without DMT, or and so on? Not even going there. Just saying, but wait a second. First and foremost, ayahuasca is a bodily experience. It's not a psyche experience first and foremost. It's this thing that when you swallow it down, it goes into your tubes, and before your psyche feels it, your stomach feels it. And then the ensuing experience, you may have these images and so on, but actually it's not just about, ayahuasca is very much about other things than just images that one associates with what a psychedelic might be. I'm not saying that we should get rid of the word psychedelic when talking about ayahuasca, because I think it also functions as a psychedelic. I think psychedelic is a Western word, and it's an interesting word, but and it's useful in the sense that actually the experience you have with a psychedelic is the experience of what's in your own psyche. And so it depends on who you are. And I think that point is well taken. But still, the way that science considers the psyche is in an absolute mind-body disconnection, which is why when science studies the so-called psychedelic ayahuasca, it can't see the vomiting. It can't even see that actually what we're dealing with is something that gives you an intense corporeal experience. Which is actually quite different just on the level of experience from if you take LSD. LSD can be actually pretty mental, pretty cerebral, oddly not very body oriented, even though sometimes you can be nauseous and it depends on what you've been doing. But still, there I think that it's not so much the lost in translation as that if we have a Western culture that makes absolute separations between its dichotomies like body and mind, and then you're trying to talk about simply the same thing, which is humans swallowing ayahuasca, but in a place where they consider the mixture to be a living entity with whom you have a kind of subjective communication, and that it goes through your body and mind. And on the other hand, they're saying, oh, it's a plant that's just a bag full of molecules, and what's going on is that it's a psychedelic. It's really going to be hard to get these two ways of looking at things to talk to each other. But I don't think that erasure is the word. It's more like we're trying to talk to each other in two different languages and that don't necessarily have the same concepts. And actually the solution is close at hand, is that if you can, let's say as a scientist, learn to think about your presuppositions, learn to think about the culture that you project onto your understanding of this radically other thing. So here we have this discombobulating therapeutic cocktail. We don't really know how it works. We don't really understand the full workings, even of just the molecules it contains on our brains and on our bodies. And I think that scientists could learn a lot from taking indigenous concepts about ayahuasca seriously. What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, like, by the way, that's the basic purpose of anthropology, like discovering that we are ethnocentric and having a kind of reflexivity on it. But we are here like talking about ontological gap between science and, let's say, indigenous shamanism. But on the other hand, when one spends time in the field, like, one notices quickly that the indigenous healers of the Amazon are usually very pragmatic people. I mean, they often see themselves as people who know the plants on their uses and who seek concrete solutions to illness and misfortune, rather than spiritual guides, coach, psychotherapists, or metaphysicians, which, by the way, often leads to misunderstanding with Western clients. So from this perspective, it can be said that psychedelic scientists and traditional healers from the Amazon have much in common. Both are, as you say, like Bastian, like both are human beings who are interested in plants and looking for remedies. And in your own work, like, you look at potential relationship between shamanism and molecular biology. And as far as I know, you even like sponsored an expedition to the rainforest for biologists to examine indigenous knowledge. And breaking news, you are like finally about to publish a book on tobacco and ayahuasca, like, which is co-written with what we could call an Amazonian philosopher from the Shawi ethnic group, Rafael Chanchari. So from these experiences, like, what mutually beneficial approach do you see possible for the future between like science and traditional indigenous knowledge?
You know, I think that it really depends on the will of individual people. I've known a lot of indigenous Amazonian people who were smart people who knew a lot of things and who would have been open to have collaborations with scientists. But actually, these collaborations have not been very numerous up until now. Even though actually, as you just said, the different practitioners have so much to talk about together, about plants that heal, how do you use them? I mean, you know, I spent a couple of weeks, as you say, chaperoning 3 molecular biologists around a shaman's place and garden and so on. And it was like, you know, the scientists were taking notes and how do you prepare this plant and how do you boil it and how long? And, you know, they were like cooks talking to each other. So actually, when you bring them, I guess it's a bit more difficult to bring shamans into the laboratory than to take people out of the laboratory and take them into the rainforest, even though that's also quite difficult for the scientists. I mean, one thing that I saw that was difficult for the scientists that I accompanied anyway, was that they had never really, it had always been ingrained into them that first person learning was not good. So that real knowledge is in the third person. And so it's in a well-lit and clean lab. It's not in a dark hut with a dirt floor where you then swallow this disgusting liquid and then have scary thoughts for 4 hours. And actually, that's the other thing, is that many of these scientists, the first thing that ayahuasca showed them was the work they needed to do on themselves. So, if you actually are a hard-boiled scientist, I think that your first experiences with ayahuasca, before getting to knowledge about whatever you're studying, it might take you into a place that, that's an ordeal to go through. Not necessarily, but it might happen. And I think that the way that scientists go about acquiring knowledge, it's more often in a kind of a safe place where you're in a lab and you've got computer screens and you've got to repeat it 10,000 times, and then you're making funding requests. But it's nothing like the actual, drinking ayahuasca is like an extreme sport or something. So that's where there are, even though I would be arguing that there are not these very big differences, that we're all humans, that we're all interested in plants and healing and whatever works. And we're also interested in learning about the limits of our knowledge. So this is all good. And that actually all we got to do is sit down and find subjects of mutual interest. And hey, if we really want to, we could be in business with 2 systems of knowledge tomorrow, if we really wanted to. And at the same time, it's true that there are these places of fundamental friction. And I think you could sum it up, which is to say that ayahuasca shamans know the world by personifying it, and scientists understand the world by objectifying it. So this is obviously a big dichotomy, and of course we need to criticize dichotomies. So here I am spouting out one more dichotomy, but still, I think that even though it is somewhat an artificial dichotomy, it still puts a finger on what is a big difference. I actually don't think that considering, for example, a tobacco plant as a bag full of molecules, and considering the same tobacco plant as being a representative of the mother of tobacco, who is a kind of a personality associated with the plant that has a powerful personality and that you got to sort of understand if you want to deal with this entity. I actually don't think that those 2 concepts are that opposed to one another. In other words, and actually this is my co-author, Rafael Chanchari, said this to me. For him, it's quite clear that you need nicotine and neurons to perceive the mother of tobacco. So that even though personifying tobacco and objectifying tobacco are different paths and they have different methods, actually they can be made to complete each other. And I would even argue that if you start to understand tobacco as Amazonian people do, and you start to understand the powerful personality of this plant, and then you understand that you need to respect the plant, you got to know about the plant, you got to fear the plant, you know that you never master this plant, but you got to avoid that it master you. That actually getting people to understand this could help them in their relationship with tobacco, probably more than if you just said, you should avoid smoking because nicotine is addictive and smoking is bad for you.
Yeah, I agree.
And so that, yes, nicotine exists. It's a molecule, works on our brains, it works on our neurons. All this is correct. But tobacco has a powerful personality, and personifying it, a little bit of personification, is not going to hurt anybody.
Yeah, maybe we should add an animist perspective to the drug addiction treatment programs in the West.
Yeah, I'm not, I'm not sure if, because animist is a word that anthropologists use. I've never met an animist who says, yeah, I'm an animist. I
Oh,
mean, you know, so it's one of those weird words. But I mean, we're not going to spend the whole 45 minutes here talking about the
yeah,
concept of animism.
yeah.
But now, here's one question that I wanted to ask you, because you've been studying ayahuasca and its uses for what is it now, 15 years?
Oh, 10 years, 12 years, maybe. Yeah, 12
Mm.
years.
And so there's a lot of interesting stuff in your writings, but in this recent article that you shared with me, you brought up, I think it's a key point, the suggestibility of hallucinogens. I'm not sure if psychedelic is a good word for ayahuasca, but hallucinogen is certainly a good word. And all the different hallucinogens do have this known tendency to increase people's suggestibility. Um, and then you talked about this as a double-edged sword and something that scientific researchers should pay attention to.
Hmm.
So could you say why you think it's a double-edged sword and why you think that scientific researchers should pay more attention to it?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and by the way, we are working on another paper with Chris Timmerman. So maybe if he's watching us, we can say hello, like precisely on this, like on the double-edged sword, like aspect of the psychedelic effect. So yeah, basically the idea is psychedelics are known for their strong conditionality on the context, and we know and I try in my work to show that not only the relationship to the, let's say, psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience is framed by social interactions and cultural background, but also its very phenomenological content. So that's why I observed, in the field, like doing a bit of comparative work in the upper Peruvian Amazon, the fact that the local cosmological and ethological theory was framing and shaping the very content of the visions that people had, like of also the auditory imagery and so on. So then if you have this on the mind, like you can understand a bit better probably like why those substances are used and the use of those substances has been institutionalized in native societies of the America, because it's as those substances appears then as a strong tool for cultural transmission. I mean, if you take ayahuasca, you can kind of verify in a really concrete and tangible way the content of some cosmological propositions, for instance, like the fact that there is some or others like supernatural beings. And I feel that that's the hypothesis that I defended in some of my work, like that probably this aspect is one of the main bases of the therapeutic effect of the ayahuasca, at least for Westerners who are like going there, because this aspect, this possibility of the hallucinogenic experience to be used as concrete and tangible verification of some cosmological proposition, or like concrete and tangible way to meet supernatural beings, like deeply change the cosmovision of the people, like their way of seeing the world, their way of seeing themselves, their way they relate to nature, to themselves, and so on. So it's producing a deep change in their worldview, and that's probably one of the main therapeutic underpinning of the ayahuasca, more than just modifying the serotonin level or whatever. So that's probably like the good aspect, but also the more worrying aspect is the fact that it sounds that the impact of the cultural context is super important, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to manage what we call what we could say the ontological status of those experiences. Like, is it real? To what extent is it real? To what extent is it produced by the context? And the fact is that when you have those experiences, like, it doesn't appear as hallucinations. It appears like as more real than reality. And the fact is that usually this experience is kind of, you can't see the social mediation, you can't see the cultural mediation that is shaping usually the content of your vision. So that's probably why, like, French government has, as you know, like banned those substances, like not for medical reasons, but because they were like kind of afraid of brainwashing or, being used by cult or whatever. And, like, so that's, yeah, that's probably, that will be challenging, like for the therapeutic application of those substances, because we will have to be like really, really careful about what you say before, what you say after, like all the context surrounding the use of the substances. And yeah.
Okay. I was thinking more about how these substances can be misused. Um, and um, and that's where I think that a lot of there is actually quite a lot of abuse that goes on in the international ayahuasca world, starting with abuse of women by male ayahuasqueros, and the suggestibility has a lot to do with it. Um, I mean, essentially, a powerful ayahuasca experience, just like another powerful hallucinogenic experience, will take your defenses down, will make you, actually will reveal your psyche. It's as if you take off the layers of protection. And so you need to be attentive to actually who you have this experience with.
Yeah, and
Like,
it can be also like a really fast and furious conversion tool, like, and it can be for the best, but also it can be problematic. And I feel that we really have to think about what we want to do with those substances, and then to see, consequently, to think about the kind of cultural setting that we want to.
well, see, now this is getting to something that's also pretty interesting and almost intriguing, which is that, frankly, you can look at any serious anthropological work on Amazonian shamanism, and it's going to be at least 50% about witchcraft or sorcery, occult sorcery. And then when ayahuasca gets transported into the Western world, it kind of gets whitewashed. And all of that sort of negative aspect of it is forgotten. And all we hear about is the therapeutic potential and the healing and so forth. And then actually, once you get into the laboratory, I mean, so you hear about all the things that ayahuasca seems to have a positive effect on, including depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder and addictions. And then you hear about all the health enhancing properties of the vine itself. And so it seems like good medicine all around. And at the same time, there are these kind of, there's the whole 50% that's actually very clear in the Amazon. It's it's gone. And I also get the feeling that if scientists are really, because, putting people in neuroimagery machines on LSD or pure psilocin is one thing, but actually giving them real live ayahuasca. And I mean, that they actually did freeze dried ayahuasca to try to reduce the vomiting. So not only are they sort of making a fiction of just what ayahuasca is, but then they're even freeze drying it. No, if we're going to actually do some real live ayahuasca studies in the lab, I think it'll be important to recognize that this stuff can be volatile in terms of what it does to people. It sort of amplifies. It can amplify ego. It can also make ego disappear. It's a complicated thing, but people can get their ego amplified and turn into messianic. I mean, not everybody, but still there is it's a powerful therapeutic tool, but precisely that double-edged aspect of it, I think, needs to be out in the open if it is going to be mastered or grasped fully in the lab.
Yeah, like, and it's funny because, like, in the 60s, psychedelic substances were considered as, with the same kind of naive approach that some people still have about those substances to nowadays. Like, it was considered as a kind of a tool for automatic political emancipation, within the framework of the hippie movement and counterculture. You had that idea that, oh yeah, take some LSD and it will just like change your mind and you will be like a revolutionary subject soon. And more recently, some radical environment movements have been advocating psychedelic disobedience, inviting people to use psychedelics as the substances will be able to make people automatically more ecological and biophile. But as social anthropologists, I'm of course like quite skeptical of these proposals. Like you were talking about like my work about socialization of hallucinations, and it's rather like the social interactions and the cultural background that influence the psychedelic experience more than the other way around. And it's funny to see, by the way, that in California, in the cradle of counterculture, we are now ironically seeing the emergence of today of uses such as microdosing, which allows senior executives in the GAFA to improve their productivity using psychedelics. So we can see with this example the way in which like the dominant culture patterns influences the use of psychedelics, which are like here put at the service of capitalist ethics. So in the light of this,
are there people microdosing ayahuasca?
I heard a bit about it, but true, like there are many like microdosing mushrooms or LSD.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel that there is some kind of some naive approach, considering that there is a kind of automatic positive effect of the substances, but it really need to consider the social setting and the social interactions, which are like ultimately deeply shaping the effect of the substances. So it's a challenge for our societies also. It's not only integrating ayahuasca to the lab, it's also think well and take the time of thinking well about what do we want to do with those substances, and consequently what kind of social setting we have to invent to surround the use of the substances.
Well said.
Thank you. I'm jumping back in. I mean, I think this can go on for another 2 hours and it will remain as interesting as it has been for now. The topic that you were just touching upon, I think this is one of the topics that will be discussed on one of our panel discussions during ICPR on mainstreaming psychedelics, where we'll take all these questions related to microdosing and the emergence of all these capitalist, you can say, approaches into psychedelics. We'll discuss the interface of those two. But before that, I did have a question of my own, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on if you have some constructive ideas on how you could add some of those anthropological insights that you've just mentioned around animism, around purging, around the corporeality, the social dimensions, into a more hard science approach. So because I heard a lot of critiques of, and I understand those. For example, around freeze drying ayahuasca, I think this was an attempt to see if I think Jordi Reba pioneered this actually, who very sadly passed away recently, of introducing the potential to do a placebo-controlled study with ayahuasca. But do you have suggestions on how the harder sciences could incorporate some of these understandings that you anthropologists have in their studies?
Yeah, maybe like it's a bit like what is already beginning to be done in this new wave of psychedelic research. First of all, like studies should integrate the importance of extra pharmacological factors, like what Timothy Leary called like set and setting. And there is for some reasons for why like indigenous people surround usually the use of the substances by like ritual context, specific interactional settings. And I feel that this aspect, extra pharmacological factors like verbal exchange, ritual action, music, perfumes, and so on, all this technology developed by indigenous people should be investigated also. Not only the neurocognitive underpinnings of the substances and so on.
Yeah, there has been some thought about how to go towards indigenous knowledge from the world of science. And for very long, the indigenous knowledge was considered, well, as you know, superstition and irrational. And so really, and animist, and so therefore to be considered a question of theology. And so, and science disbelieved in it. But then if science is to go towards indigenous knowledge, it's not a question of suddenly believing in it and doing the opposite, because believing or disbelieving still continues to put it on the terrain of theology. But if you're talking about something like the power of an Icaro song on somebody who has consumed ayahuasca, or if you're talking about how a dieta before the experience and after the experience can influence it, these are concepts that are still today considered animist, but I think incorrectly so, in the sense that they're not really a question of belief. They're more a question they're a pragmatic question of being in the world. That if I sing this melody on this person who has drunk this plant mixture, it will impact on their body and mind in a certain way. And it's a subjectively verifiable proposition. So it's, and now then the very hard scientists, that was one of the difficulties I had with your question, Jos, is like, you know, how can we get hard science into this? I think one of the things is that if we're going to have an interface between indigenous knowledge and science, science is going to have to leave the hard in the changing room for a little while. And what we want is an open science, not a hard science, a science that takes the other side seriously. And it's not a question of believing or disbelieving. It's a question of, and it's not either about explaining it or rationalizing it. It's just listening to it on its own terms and then seeing what that brings out in our own way of thinking. You know, it's like drawing out its consequences without judging it. So here are these practitioners who say that dieting and singing is central to this whole thing. Well, let's look into it. An open science, and it's true, it's hard to do hard science on modified consciousness, singing, diets, vomiting. Oh my goodness. Actually, vomiting is a very concrete proposition. You know, we want a hard science of vomiting, please.
Yeah, and by the way, like that's probably what the interest of anthropology, because like, as you know, probably know, like participative observation is like one of the main methodology of this discipline. And I mean, when you participate to those rituals, it's leading you to check really concretely that so-called folkloric practices as singing or blowing perfumes on your body during rituals has a really concrete and tangible impact on the phenomenology of your experience. So yeah, I would totally agree with Jeremy proposal, but then like it's something that we could probably like explore in a really more systematic way, you know, like the impact of the indigenous technologies on to what extent they are able to help us to manage to a certain extent the experience.
But, you know, pleased that we agree, of course, but actually I'm just thinking about our hard science friends. You know, there is some work that they can do tout suite, which would be take pure ayahuasca vine extract and give it to people and put them in brain imagery machines and try to get a better understanding of how this DMT-less ayahuasca actually impacts on the brain. It does seem to be psychoactive. It does seem to generate images and understandings. And actually, it's very interesting. It's also full of compounds that are good for your body and for the health. So getting a clear understanding of the different active molecules in the ayahuasca vine and how they work on the brain and the body. And, you know, they can bring all the reductionist tools and everything, and they can do hard science on that. And frankly, I'd be the first to read their studies.
So can I surmise that these reductionist tools in reality are just not sufficient to study the immense complexities involved with ayahuasca on all different levels, not just the level of different molecular compounds, but all the social and cultural and interactive elements as well?
The
Well,
fact, sorry. Yeah.
vas-y, David.
Yeah. The fact is that culture is not just a background, surrounding vaguely the experience. It's like social interactions are deeply shaping the very content of the phenomenological features of the experience. So I mean, it's really part of the art of the seeing. So it's a bit pointless to just extract the substance and then think like, oh, okay, extracting the substance will like study like the very art of the effect, like. And also like it's a technology, so we have to the practices of the indigenous healers, for instance, of the Peruvian Amazon, they have developed like a crazy really impressive technology, leading them to be able to manage to a certain extent the experience. And like it sounds fascinating, like to explore like how they do so, and to also like how we could also like develop some aspect, like I don't know, the power of music, of perfumes, the impact of those stuff on the experience.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, but I would say also, Jost, to your question, that personally, and I think like most people interested in science, when you're dealing with something like ayahuasca, you want to know what are the molecules in the brew. And then you want to read about how they impact on your brain and so forth. I mean, I like to know what the shamans say, and I like to know what the scientists say, and I think that they're both important. Now, but with the case of ayahuasca, and I'm just talking about the vine and the pure extract you can make from it, because they've been looking for the active principle, and that harmine, harmaline, and tetrahydroharmine individually, where it did not seem to be present in high enough doses to be able to explain the psychoactivity, then they just thought, okay, well, the psychoactivity comes from somewhere else. They didn't look, for example, at the interaction of those molecules. It's called the entourage effect. And now there are scientists who understand this and who are looking into it, but they've had to overcome that reductionist tendency to look for the active principle. But that reductionist tendency has also got us to where we are now with molecular biology. We know about DNA, we know about cell receptors, we know about DMT and all these LSD and individual molecules. And this is good, and we thank reductionism. And at the same time, if we just get stuck there, then we're going to miss, I think, some essential things that are going on, in particular in the cocktail that is ayahuasca, just the pure vine extract, in terms of how do those 3 beta-carboline compounds work together, and how do they work with the other bioactive substances that are in the brew. So more research is needed, not just the reductionist kind, but the kind that then knows how to put the pieces together and look at their synergies.
Yes. So I have a question from the attendees that ties into that, and I'm a little afraid to ask it because I think this will provide enough discussion for another half hour. But I was wondering if either of you could, or both could, elaborate a little bit on the role of tobacco in Amazonian shamanism.
Jeremy, feel free. You just wrote a book about it.
Yeah. Well, okay. Tobacco is the #1 shamanic plant in the Amazon, ahead of ayahuasca. It's the most used therapeutic agent. It's used as an analgesic when there are snake bites and so on. It has many uses. When people are wounded, they apply tobacco leaves. They blow tobacco smoke. There are areas where they blow tobacco smoke on babies so that they have firm bodies and are healthy. Really, tobacco is the #1 teacher plant. And it's also the #1 combo plant, because you use tobacco with all the other plants, including ayahuasca. And this is something that also tends not to get translated back into the laboratory. your average Amazonian ayahuasquero, it wouldn't even cross his or her mind to take ayahuasca without tobacco. It is just obvious that tobacco is a complement to the medicine when you use ayahuasca. But still, and then there's anthropologists like Françoise Barbira-Friedman. She's studied how they attribute gender to shamanic plants in the Amazon. Most master plants are considered feminine, except ayahuasca, which is actually does not have a fixed identity. But tobacco is considered masculine, and that the kind of structuring element to the use of all the other medicinal plants. And that's how Amazonian people think about it. So in Amazonian terms, tobacco could not be more important. And you could not really understand the whole ayahuasca as a plant teacher thing if you didn't also look at tobacco as a plant teacher. And they're actually very similar. All of these plant teachers, they say they have two souls. They can teach you things, but they can also harm you. And tobacco is, and you find tobacco used in sorcery just as much as you find it used in healing. So it really does have that. It's even more two-sided than ayahuasca, if that's possible. So yes, from an Amazonian perspective, tobacco is absolutely central. I don't know if you'd want to add anything, David.
No, it's okay. It was good. Good enough.
Thank you. That was pretty succinct, actually. Okay, final question before we wrap this up. Another question: if you know of any studies or you've done any studies yourself in which the ayahuasquero or the curandero or curandera takes the medicine and not the patient. Is there any research out there? And if so, what does it say? Or what can you tell about it?
I'll start, David, and then you can tell me what you think. It turns out, the Amazon's a big place, and there's a lot of differences from one place to another. And, in some parts, it used to be a practice for the whole village to take it, including young children. In other parts, like you can look at what Gail Highpine wrote in an article available online called Unraveling the Mystery of the Origin of Ayahuasca. And she did her research with the Napo Runa people in Ecuador. And she would say that actually most people didn't like to drink ayahuasca. They'd go and see the ayahuasca therapist, and he would encourage them to drink or say that they could drink, but they tended not to want to do that because they said it was scary and so on. Then there are other places where what they really like is the purge, and they drink purgahuasca without the heavy DMT effects. So, and then, for example, with the Shawi expert that I just did a book with, it depends on his patients. He actually treats some patients with ayahuasca when he sees that they're in a depressed mindset. And he treats them like these studies that study ayahuasca and depression. One good dose of ayahuasca can change somebody's depressed mindset in a positive way for months. And so they call themselves médicos, this Shawi médico living in Iquitos. Depending on the client who shows up, either he'll drink the ayahuasca himself to do the diagnostic and he'll just blow tobacco on the person, or he'll think, this person needs a dose of ayahuasca to sort of get them out of the rut they're in. And so, sometimes only the practitioner drinks. Other times the whole village drinks. And it really depends on the different traditions. Peter Gao, who was talking about the Piro people I mentioned before, the Piro people who said ayahuasca is good to vomit and good to see. At the beginning of this century, when Peter Gao was doing his fieldwork, he said the whole village would drink. And essentially the ayahuasquero would boil up some brew, and anybody who came over that evening was welcome to have some. And a lot of people would drink. So, the uses and what is traditional, really, it's a big patchwork. I don't know, David, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, of course. And we were talking about reductionism, but first of all, we are here also in front of what we could call a therapeutic reductionism, because first of all, like ayahuasca is used mainly in the Western Amazon, but for various social purposes, like as hunting, witchcraft, initiatic rituals, or even recreative purpose. So ayahuasca is not a medicine, you know, like that idea is absolutely not. Yeah, it's more like an invention from the West, as the shamanism, you know, but it can be used for some therapeutic practices. And again, even when it's used for therapeutic practices, it depends on the social groups. In some social groups, it's only the shaman who is using it, like to kind of see more clearly the origin of and the nature of the disease. In other groups, it's like the patients who has to take it, like to cleanse themselves by purging. So there is a tremendous diversity of the use of ayahuasca, the social purpose of the use of ayahuasca, and we really have to break with that, you know, idea of fixed tradition, like homogeneous tradition in the Amazon, like it's, yeah, as opposed to the Western approach of ayahuasca. It's really not as easy like that, you know.
There you have it.
There you have it. Thank you very much, you both. This has truly been a pleasure. It's wonderful to have had this opportunity to have Jeremy here. Thank you so much, David. We'll be seeing you again, luckily.
Yeah, for the closure of the event, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. You will be one of the final speakers on Sunday of ICPR, where you'll be speaking in a track on the globalization of ayahuasca, which is not a perfect fit. I know we've been exchanging messages back and forth. It's always hard when doing an interdisciplinary conference to fit people into perfect tracks together. And sometimes people shouldn't actually be in tracks together, because that's how you get interesting tensions between people who come from different scientific disciplines. And on that note, related to ayahuasca, as I said during the introduction, we'll have a whole day dedicated to ayahuasca research, which includes some of the studies that you mentioned. Your own research will be addressed there, but also Helle Kasik, her study on the chemical composition of ayahuasca that Jeremy addressed previously. Some people had questions about the role and value of ethnography, anthropology, qualitative research. We'll have a whole track on that as well. I'm doing a little bit of promotion of the ayahuasca track for people who aren't already into ICPR, who haven't registered yet. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to is we'll have a special track on ayahuasca in the lab, where I'm not sure if you're familiar with their research plans, but a Brazilian neuroscientist, a Czech psychiatrist, and a group of Hunikui, and maybe I think some Ashinanka as well, have done a joint research program where they see if they can use some of these neuroscience measures, taking EEG measures in the jungle, so in the original context, and taking people out of that context into the lab and to see what comes out of that. And we'll have a critical discussion on that. Emilia Sanabria, who's a medical anthropologist, will be providing some critical reflections on that. One of the things that we were really hoping for the in-person event is to have a lot of time to discuss this in person. We have Leopardo Yavabané, a Hunikui leader. He will be joining on Zoom. This will be a little bit of a challenge for translation reasons, but also because it's not easy to fit somebody's whole cultural context into a short 10-minute Zoom presentation. So we'll see how it goes, but I am really looking forward to that. And in addition, we'll have some actual clinical research. We'll have some randomized clinical trials, some people developing pharmahuasca for the use of mental health disorders, and some DMT, M5-MeO DMT imaging studies, and other research. So for people who found this interesting, who want to know more, ICPR2020.net. If you add /tickets, you can find out how to register for the conference. You still have a few days. Jeremy, I actually just heard about your new book. I've really enjoyed your previous books. They're fantastic. So if you could provide us with a link, we'll share that with the audience as well. Is it out?
No, actually, it's going to come out in French first, and I don't even have an English language editor, even though it's written in English originally. But stay tuned and
stay tuned. Is that foreseeable for this year still?
no, it'll be for next year.
Okay. So on another note, for people who joined through Huva, if you've experienced any audio or video issues, please let us know. There's kind of a weird situation where depending on the browser and the app that you use, you view us differently, either the two speakers next to each other or one after the other. Please let us know. This has been a tryout for us as well. But I think this is a little bit representative of the kinds of discussions we generally have at our conferences. And I am really looking forward to the next couple of days. We'll start on Thursday evening, 6 o'clock here in Amsterdam. So you have to find out how that translates to the time zones that you are in. With a human bingo, we'll continue with documentary screening of Trip of Compassion. For those who haven't seen it, I've seen it personally. I've seen it 3 times, and it hit me just as hard each time that I saw it. It's a very powerful documentary on the experiences of people with severe post-traumatic stress that are being treated with MDMA. And they use live footage of the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions where you can see the healing processes that people go through. And it really impacted me. So that's the official opening on Thursday. And then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday will be chock full of all kinds of interdisciplinary research. So once more, thank you very much, Jeremy and Davi, for joining. It's been wonderful. It's an honor and a pleasure. And I look forward to our future encounters.
Yes. Thank you. You both.
Thank you very much, all. And see you at ICPR.
Yeah. See you. Bye-bye.
So